25,000 years ago, somewhere on the edge of a glacier that covered half a continent, a newborn let out its first cry into air cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Outside the shelter, the temperature was dropping toward levels that would kill an unprotected adult within hours. Inside, wrapped in layers of cured hide, pressed against the warmth of its mother's body, that same infant had a chance. Not a guarantee, a chance. The Ice Age was not a single storm to survive. It was tens of thousands of years of relentless cold, unpredictable food, and a world with no hospitals, no formula, no heated rooms. And yet, against odds that should have made human infancy nearly impossible, our ancestors didn't just survive the Ice Age. They emerged from it, generation after generation, having kept enough babies alive to become every person alive today. This is the story of how they did it. Not through one invention, but through an entire system of survival built layer by layer around the most fragile member of any group, the newborn. To understand how remarkable infant survival was during the Ice Age, we first have to understand exactly what was working against it. Human babies are, by the standards of the animal kingdom, almost absurdly unprepared for the world at birth. They cannot regulate their own body temperature effectively. They cannot move on their own. They are entirely dependent on adults for warmth, food, and protection for years rather than weeks or months. Now place that infant in an environment where nighttime temperatures could fall dramatically below freezing, where a sudden storm could trap a group away from shelter, and where a poor hunting season could mean weeks of reduced food for a nursing mother. Estimates drawn from skeletal remains and comparisons with more recent hunter-gatherer societies suggest that infant and child mortality during the Paleolithic period was extremely high, plausibly resulting in the loss of a large proportion of children before they reached adulthood. This wasn't a minor obstacle to be shrugged off. It was the central, ongoing crisis of Ice Age life, and it meant that every strategy a group could develop to tip the odds even slightly in a newborn's favor would have been observed, refined, and passed on with tremendous care. Survival wasn't left to chance. It was engineered, piece by piece, out of the only resources available: fire, fur, bodies, and each other. The first and most fundamental of those resources was heat itself. Long before the depths of the Ice Age, hominins had already mastered fire, and by the time modern humans were raising infants on the fringes of the great ice sheets, controlled fire was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. Archaeological sites across Ice Age Europe and Asia show hearths positioned at the heart of living spaces, often surrounded by evidence of prolonged repeated use. The same fire pits rebuilt and relit over years or generations, anchoring the daily rhythm of a group's life around a stable heat source. Shelter itself was engineered with similar deliberation. In the open, treeless landscapes near the ice sheets, some groups built dwellings from mammoth bones, massive tusks and skulls stacked and interlocked to form a frame, likely covered with hides, creating an enclosed space that could be heated far more efficiently than open air. In rock shelters and caves, the natural insulation of stone was reinforced with hide screens hung across entrances to block wind, and with thick layers of dry grass, moss, or fur laid down as bedding to separate sleeping bodies from cold ground. For an infant, this meant that the harshest edge of the Ice Age environment was never allowed to reach them directly. A newborn was never simply left in the open cold. It existed inside a series of nested barriers. The shelter, the fire, the bedding, each one built and maintained specifically to buy that child a survivable microclimate within an otherwise lethal environment. Fire and shelter did more than fight the cold, too. The Ice Age landscape was shared with predators fully capable of killing a human adult, let alone a child. Cave lions, cave hyenas, and wolves all competed with early humans for territory and prey across the same glacial margins. A fire kept burning through the night was as much a defensive perimeter as a heat source. And enclosed shelters, a mammoth bone dwelling, a cave entrance sealed with hide, a hearth positioned to block the wind and the approach of anything moving toward it, served the same dual purpose. An infant sleeping at the center of a group, behind a wall of adults, inside a space lit and warmed by fire, was protected from two threats at once with the same set of tools. But shelter and fire alone couldn't move with a group. Ice Age humans were not settled in one place all year. Many groups followed migrating game, tracked seasonal resources, and traveled across difficult terrain. That meant warmth had to become portable, carried directly on the body in the form of clothing. One of the most significant technological developments of the Ice Age wasn't a weapon or a tool for hunting, it was the eyed sewing needle. Carved from bone or ivory, these needles, some dating back over 40,000 years, allowed people to do something far more sophisticated than simply draping an animal hide over their shoulders. They could tailor it. Fitted, layered clothing, form-cut sleeves, hoods, and closed seams stitched tight with sinew thread. Trapped body heat far more effectively than loose wrapping ever could. For infants, this innovation was transformative. Rather than being left swaddled in a single loose hide, a newborn could be dressed in small fitted garments designed specifically for their size. Soft inner furs against the skin for warmth, tougher outer layers to block wind. Ethnographic accounts of more recent Arctic-adapted peoples who faced comparable cold describe infants carried in specially designed pouches built into a parent's own outer clothing or in separate fur-lined infant carriers, keeping the baby's body heat trapped against the caregiver's own, while still leaving the adult's hands and arms free to work. This idea of carrying an infant close to an adult's body wasn't just about warmth either. It solved a second problem entirely: mobility. A Paleolithic group could not afford to leave a caregiver behind while others traveled, hunted, or gathered. By binding an infant securely against the body, likely using hide slings or wraps, given the near universal presence of similar practices across virtually every documented hunter-gatherer society on Earth, a mother or other caregiver could keep both hands free and keep moving without ever setting the child down in the cold. Clothing and carrying solved the problem of heat loss to the environment, but even the best fitted fur couldn't fully replace the single most effective heat source available to any Ice Age group: another human body. Human body temperature runs close to 37 degrees Celsius, and a single adult radiates a meaningful amount of heat. Multiply that by several adults and children sleeping in close physical contact, insulated together under shared furs, and you get a heat retention system considerably more effective than any individual could achieve alone. Co-sleeping. Infants sleeping in direct physical contact with a parent or other caregiver was almost certainly the default arrangement for Ice Age families, not a matter of preference, but a matter of survival. A newborn placed at the center of a small huddle of adult bodies, under multiple layers of hide, in a shelter already warmed by a hearth, experienced a dramatically different thermal environment than the same infant would have alone. This layered strategy, shelter, fire, clothing, and shared body heat, meant that no single failure point had to be fatal. If the fire burned low overnight, body heat and fur still provided a buffer. If a garment came loose, the warmth of a caregiver's chest was still there. This constant physical closeness had a secondary function beyond temperature regulation, too. It made it possible to notice trouble immediately. A change in an infant's breathing, a drop in warmth, the earliest signs of illness. All of these were far easier to detect for a caregiver in constant physical contact with a child than for one sleeping even a short distance away. In an environment with no medicine as we would recognize it today, early detection of anything going wrong may have been one of the only interventions available. Of course, warmth and shelter meant little if an infant wasn't also being fed, and in the Ice Age, that food source came from one place only. Before the invention of agriculture, before pottery, before any reliable way to store or prepare a substitute food safe for an infant's digestive system, breast milk was the only viable source of nutrition for a newborn. And it remained the primary food source for a child for a remarkably long stretch of early life. Isotopic analysis of ancient infant remains, chemical signatures preserved in bone and teeth that reflect diet at the time of death, has allowed researchers to estimate that breastfeeding in some Paleolithic populations likely continued, at least as a significant supplement, for several years, considerably longer than is typical in many parts of the world today. This extended nursing period wasn't a cultural preference so much as a biological necessity dictated by the environment. In a world where hunting success was unpredictable and where no soft, digestible substitute food was reliably available, Breast milk offered a consistent, sterile, perfectly balanced source of calories and immunity boosting compounds precisely when an infant needed them most. It also meant that a nursing mother's own nutritional status became directly tied to her infant's survival, placing enormous importance on ensuring that pregnant and nursing women had reliable access to food, even during lean seasons. This dependency likely shaped group behavior far beyond the mother infant pair itself. If an infant's survival depended so heavily on one caregiver's ability to produce milk, and that caregiver's own survival depended on the food and protection provided by the wider group, then infant survival was never truly a private individual matter. It was, from the very beginning, a shared responsibility. And that shared responsibility extended well beyond feeding. Modern research into hunter-gatherer societies has consistently pointed to a pattern known as alloparenting. Child rearing shared across multiple members of a group, not confined to biological parents alone. Grandmothers, older siblings, aunts, and unrelated adults within the same band commonly took on direct roles in feeding, carrying, watching, and comforting infants and young children. For Ice Age humans, this pattern likely wasn't optional generosity. It was a necessary buffer against the very high stakes involved. If a mother was ill, injured, or occupied with essential tasks like gathering or processing food, an infant left without any alternative caregiver would have been in serious danger. A group with multiple adults invested in a child's survival dramatically increased the number of situations in which that child could be rescued from a dangerous moment. A caregiver noticing the fire had died down, another spotting early signs of hypothermia, a third simply providing an extra layer of warmth on a colder than usual night. Older, post-reproductive women in particular are believed to have played an outsized role in this system, a pattern sometimes called the grandmother hypothesis, which proposes that the unusually long human female lifespan beyond fertility evolved in part because grandmothers who helped raise grandchildren improved those children's odds of survival, allowing the trait for longevity itself to be favored by evolution over time. In an Ice Age band, an experienced older woman, freed from the demands of pregnancy and nursing, could dedicate her full attention and accumulated knowledge to keeping infants and toddlers warm, fed, and safe. This network mattered just as much when illness struck as when the weather did. With no medicine as we would recognize it today, an infant running a fever or struggling to feed had only the group's collective attention as a defense. Extra warmth, extra closeness, someone free to hold and monitor the child around the clock while others continued the work of keeping the group fed. A single overwhelmed parent might miss the early signs of a worsening illness. A band of several attentive caregivers taking turns was far less likely to. This cooperative structure meant that the survival of any single infant was never resting on one person's shoulders alone. It was distributed across an entire network of caregivers, and the evidence for how seriously that network took its responsibility survives remarkably in the archaeological record itself. At a site called Sungir, in present-day Russia, archaeologists uncovered one of the most striking burials from the Ice Age. Two children laid head-to-head in a shared grave, their bodies covered with an extraordinary quantity of carefully carved mammoth ivory beads, tens of thousands of them, along with ivory spears, pins, and pendants, all representing an immense investment of time and skill by the community that buried them. Whatever these children's lives had been, their deaths were marked with a level of ceremonial care that tells us their community placed enormous emotional and social value on children. Elsewhere, at Dolní Věstonice in the present-day Czech Republic, archaeologists found the tracks of small human footprints preserved in what had once been damp clay near a kiln. The footprints of children, walking alongside adults in a space used for working clay and firing small figurines, suggesting children were present participants in the daily working life of the group, not kept apart from it. Infant burials themselves, found at multiple Ice Age sites, sometimes include deliberate grave goods. Ochre pigment, small ornaments, tools scaled for a child's hand, items that would have taken time and resources to prepare, offered to a child whose life may have lasted only weeks or months. These are not the burial practices of a society that treated infant death with indifference. They are the traces of communities that fought hard for every child's survival, and that grieved deeply and visibly when that fight was lost. Taken together, this evidence, the hearths, the needles, the shared sleeping spaces, the isotopic signatures of prolonged nursing, the elaborate child burials, sketches an unmistakable picture. Ice Age infant survival was not a matter of luck. It was the product of deliberate, coordinated, technologically sophisticated effort, sustained by an entire community, generation after generation. Every layer of that ancient survival system. The fire kept burning through the night, the fitted furs stitched with a bone needle, the deliberate closeness of bodies sharing warmth, the extended months and years of nursing, the watchful presence of grandmothers, siblings, and neighbors, the sheer communal will to protect the smallest and most vulnerable member of the group, had to work well enough, often enough, for our species to still be here at all. We are, every one of us, the descendants of infants who made it through winters that killed a great many who did not. We carry forward, whether we realize it or not, behaviors that trace directly back to that Ice Age system. Parents who instinctively hold a newborn close to their chest, who feel the pull to check on a sleeping child in the night, who rely on the help of grandparents, siblings, and friends rather than raising a child in total isolation. These aren't just modern habits. They are the living residue of a survival strategy tens of thousands of years in the making. The Ice Age asked an almost impossible question of every human group living through it. How do you keep a creature as fragile as a newborn alive in a world built to kill it? And the answer our ancestors found wasn't a single brilliant invention. It was an entire interlocking system of fire, fur, food, and fierce collective care, built by hand, refined over countless generations, and passed down successfully enough times that it eventually produced every single person alive to hear this story today.